Hello everyone. Today I will be presenting transaction cost economics, its theoretical framework and the application of it. And with me I have Jaimini, Linnea and Greta. So first I will go through the history of it, its conceptual development, its fundamental argument, and then contemporary issues. So why transaction cost economics? Well, it started with questions such as these by Descartes and Darwin. Descartes asked himself, why do firms exist? And his answer to that was that it's a divine force that guarantees its existence and rationale. And Darwin, he said that it just exists because it has evolved. But as time developed, we came further in our understanding, and this enabled us to also ask more pointed questions. And so on our right here we have Ronald Coase, and he asked himself, what explains the boundaries of the firm? And his answer to this was transaction costs. There is a cost to each transaction. And as such, the firm might want to integrate some transactions into itself. And then this later developed to when and why should a firm make rather than buy, with Oliver Williamson in 1985. And his answer was the economics of governance of these transactions. And this later developed into transaction cost economics, which they both received Nobel Prizes for. So on our right here we have Oliver Williamson, who popularized transaction costs economics during the 70s. And here we have the theoretical development of transaction cost economics, which stems from three literatures. It's economics, organizational literature, and then legal literature. So in the beginning of the 19th century, or 20th century, we had the neoclassical economics with supply and demand, and perfectly rational humans, and with perfect knowledge of everything, and we have perfect knowledge of the desires and the value of all the different goods that they could purchase. And the purpose of economics was seen, and still is seen, as a problem of adapting to change. How can we adapt to change, and how can we do so efficiently? There's two forms of doing so: via markets or via hierarchies or organizations. Where you have markets, you have the price mechanism, which dictates what is good to buy versus not. And then via hierarchies, you have the development of organizations, which is essentially the production function. And so transaction cost economics combines both of these modes of looking at the economizing or economic governance. Also, at the beginning of the 20th century, we saw criticism of the neoliberal assumptions of perfect rationality. So we have Simon, 1947, with his administrative behavior, where they start to speak about bounded rationality. We don't exactly know what we want. We can't value everything perfectly. We don't know every person that we can transact with. So we are boundedly rational. We want to be rational, but we are only limited in our ability to be so. So this produces a realistic explanation of human behavior, and this also leads to transaction costs, which I will explain later. It also introduces the problem with opportunism and uncertainty that creates economic risk in each transaction, which has not been recognized by neoclassical economics. And the role of opportunism also presents the requirement of contracts. And during this time, we also saw the development of relational forms of contracts. We recognize that, well, not all transactions are written through a contract. Many of the transactions that we have are composed through relationships. But sometimes we need contracts when the relationships cease to work. And so what transaction cost economics, the critical decision for a manager in a firm is the decision to make or to buy. And so with this theoretical development that we've seen during the 20th century, we can assume that humans are realistic. We have imperfect knowledge. We don't know everything in the world. We're boundedly rational, and we don't have all the same preferences for what we would like to consume. And this gives us a realistic view on human psychology and introduces the risk of opportunism during transactions, when a party, for instance, cannot deliver their part of the exchange, or, for instance, when a party chooses to take opportunity of the other party that does not completely know to what extent the other party will be able to deliver their side of the contract. And so this opportunism leads to uncertainty. There's a risk when doing investments that the other party does not deliver. And so this creates an increased demand to write contracts, and so it creates a transaction cost. And additionally, you need to enforce and monitor this agreement between the two parties after the decision has been made to conclude an agreement. And additionally, we have the imperfect knowledge, which creates friction in market transactions. And these are composed of search and information and also decision costs. You need to find the product, you need to decide which product to buy, etc. And so the core concepts in transaction cost economics are, it's based on the transaction as the unit of analysis. In neoclassical economics, you view the good as the unit of analysis, but here it is the transaction. And this is affected by frequency, the asset specificity, and the uncertainty of the transaction. And this creates different transaction costs and different ideal governance mode. And governance modes, these are either to transact via a market or through a hierarchy or an organization, or hybrid forms, which was introduced by Oliver Williamson. And hybrid is the contracts or relationships. And so during a transaction, before the transaction starts, you have search and information costs from the party that's buying. And then you have bargaining and decision costs. You have to create a contract and you have to decide on a price. And then after the contract has been made, you have monitoring and enforcement costs. You have to make sure that the contract is upheld by the parties. So all of this creates transaction costs. It's costs that are not reflected in the price, but it's around it. It's a lot of energy that needs to be put into doing this thing called a transaction. As such, there is a transaction cost in all transactions. And so the efficient alignment hypothesis, which is one of the papers, is that if you use the right governance mode, i.e. if you do the transaction in-house, you buy or you produce the product on your own, or if you buy it via the market, you will have different performances. And so, for instance, when the asset is very specific, for instance, with a factory, and durable, like for a long time, and it's intense, it's a big investment, then you will also oftenly use this, then you will want to vertically integrate this, as seen here in the right-hand matrix. Whereas generic products or commodities such as wheat, paper, maybe metal, you would want to source from the market, as these are generic and there's often many suppliers. They're not very specific. And so the efficient alignment hypothesis essentially says that if you do your transactions right, then you will have higher performance. And so to see if this is correct, there's been many articles which have investigated this. And what we can see here, this is a meta-analysis of 200 different articles where they looked at how firms organize their transactions. And you can see that they organize it, for instance, when the asset is very specific, they will tend to choose the organizational form or hierarchy to buy or to make the product themselves. Or they choose the relational form. That's the .19 and .29 correlation or beta. And we also see that when these transactions are well aligned with the right governance mode, you will see an increased performance by 0.10 or 0.40%. Yes. And so that's the core of transaction cost economics. We know that it works. If you do the things that transaction cost economics says, then the company will most likely have a higher performance. And so we can think of transaction cost economics in a changing world. To conclude, we know that transaction cost economics it's useful when understanding what happens to governance issues in the presence of new technologies such as digitalization. For instance, we might expect digitalization to reduce transaction costs by reducing search costs, for instance. We now have applications which allows us to find products much easier. Yeah. And so some discussion questions is we're looking back. Current deglobalization trends brings us back to Hayek, which in 1945 says that what distinguishes a high-performance economy is its capacity to adapt efficiently to uncertainty. When things are changing, if the economy is performing well, then they will adapt efficiently. And then we can ask ourselves, how can transaction cost economics enable us to adapt to the current changes that we're seeing with deglobalization? And what changes to governance modes might we see in different types of transactions? And then we have 2 more discussion questions here. Yes, thank you very much. And here's a nice quote from Ronald. A large part of what we think of as economic activity is designed to accomplish what high transaction costs would otherwise prevent. Thank you.